Welcome, everyone. My name is Kerri Young. I am SF Heritage's Programs and Communications Director. And so thank you all so much for joining us on the 119th anniversary of San Francisco's 1906 earthquake and fire. And we're seeing a lot of familiar faces in here, which is really lovely. But for those of you who are new and maybe don't know about us in San Francisco Heritage, we are a nonprofit, and our mission is to preserve and enhance San Francisco's unique architectural and cultural identity. And we've been around for a little over 50 years, and our work includes advocacy for historic resources, educational programming, and the preservation and interpretation of two landmark properties, one of which features prominently in our program tonight. And I won't spoil it now, but it does feature heavily. I spoiled it yesterday, but I won't spoil it tonight. And so San Francisco Heritage is, we're also a membership organization. So we do encourage you to join us as a member if you haven't already, and just help us preserve the places that make the city special. And I'll make sure to share all of these relevant links and more information in the chat tonight as well. And so a lot of you are here tonight because we have some of San Francisco's favorite historians to walk us through an essential piece of our city's history through a really, I think, a really unique lens here. And so Woody LaBounty and David Gallagher, you both may know them. They started the Western Neighborhoods Project, a nonprofit dedicated to the history of the city's West Side. That was back in 1999. Woody and David.
Yep.
And it was also there and where they started the popular Outside Land San Francisco podcast, which many of you may have listened, where the 1906 earthquake and fire history made frequent appearances and had got frequent mentions. That podcast is still going strong today, and we encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. Woody is now, of course, San Francisco Heritage's president and CEO. And David now runs a project called SF Memory, where he makes available really awesome historical research materials, as well as just a treasure trove of San Francisco and Bay Area historical photographs. And so I really encourage you to check that out as well. Check out the site, follow SF Memory on social media, follow SF Heritage on social media. Again, I'll put everything in the chat as we go along, but that's us. We're excited to welcome you tonight. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to Woody and David. But thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Kerri. We're really excited about doing this show. As I said before, we officially started. We got to do this show last night, so you people are in a treat because we have all our problems worked out, and I think we've got it down now. It's going to be a fun evening of talking about the earthquake and fire. But David, we want to be clear that there's so much to talk about with the earthquake and fire, and we're not going to cover everything. Is that right? David, is that right? I think I've lost David.
David, you're muted.
I'm muted. That's right, Woody. Yes, absolutely. There's so much to talk about with the earthquake. It was probably the biggest event that ever happened within the city of San Francisco. And there are thousands of stories of relief efforts and people displaced and all kinds of things. Every person who experienced it had a story, and we're going to tell just one man's story who recorded it pretty soon after the earthquake.
Yeah, and during, he experiences the earthquake, and what was great is he wrote down his memories very early, and we get to kind of follow him through it. But overall, the earthquake, it is it is maybe the seminal moment in the San Francisco that we know today. It really changed the way the city thought of itself, the way it looks. It was a disaster. This is something, people like to talk about, the recovery, which is important, but it was a disaster. More than 200,000 people were displaced from their homes. 80% of the city's buildings were destroyed in the fire that followed. And we have signs of it you can still see today. Peter Hartlaub wrote a great article in the Chronicle today, kind of looking at buildings that are around today that were around before the earthquake and have survived or been restored, like this bank, Hibernia Bank building at McAllister, Jones, and Market. It's a very familiar building, kind of near the library that you can see today, but you can see it got through the earthquake and fire somehow. And the other thing I think, David, we're going to talk about is this gentleman who lived through the disaster. People think of the earthquake, and yes, the earthquake was big. You see these buildings tipped over and collapsed facades, but it was really the fires that followed the earthquake that made the majority of the disaster and impacted the city the most. In fact, I used to say when I was a kid, old timers, relatives of mine who grew up in the city, they would often call it the 1906 fire and not the
Right.
1906 earthquake. So,
Right. I mean, one thing that I learned in looking at thousands of earthquake pictures over the years with my work at Western Neighborhoods Project was that the city didn't just go poof and disappear. It took a while, and the realization of the people was something that came upon them. Yeah, the earthquake woke everybody up, but the fire that was relentless just uh, kept them on their toes for 3 days or more.
yeah. So let's talk about our hero, or the person we're going to follow tonight, James B. Stetson. And the other thing that made this a very appropriate account for us at San Francisco Heritage to talk about is James B. Stetson, at the time of the earthquake, was living essentially 2 blocks from our headquarters, the Haas-Lilienthal House on Franklin Street. He lived on the northwest corner of Van Ness Avenue and Clay. You see his house here on the right. And he was a wealthy man, as this house pretty much indicates. He was the president of the California Street Cable Railway, the cable car line that still runs on California Street. And he made most of his money with a firm called Holbrook, Merrill, and Stetson, which made stoves and tinware and later plumbing supplies. So he was a man of some wealth, and he was a widower at the time. He had grown children. At the time of the earthquake, he was about 75 years old. So just keep that in mind as we follow him through the streets and across the 3 days of disaster, that this is a 75-year-old trudging up and down these hills. This is the site of the Stetson house today. We're going to talk a little bit about this because the fires are going to come closer and closer to Stetson's house. And I just want you to know what we're talking about, where it is today. It's the northwest corner of Clay and Van Ness. And you're like, wow, this is a very different scene from the old house. And David, can we talk a little bit about what Van Ness Avenue was like at the time of the 1906 earthquake?
Venice Avenue, I think you could describe it as a grand boulevard lined with with businessmen's houses, the results of their work, which are all kind of show places and beautiful mansions and everything. And we just saw Stetson's house, and Stetson's house was rather modest when you compare it to some of the other buildings on that street. Van Ness was the street where parades went up and down, people gathered, and the rich, like we say, the rich businessmen, showed off the results of their work.
Right, and the Haas-Lilienthal House, that totally fits the model, even though it was 1 block up on Franklin Street. William Haas was a very successful wholesale grocer, and, yeah, Van Ness was a place where you kinda showed off your wealth, and you wanted your house, your residence, even your mansion in some cases, to really, reflect to the world how successful you are. So, a little different than today, but that's what it looked like at the earthquake. So, let's orient people. Here's a map. Franklin Street is at the top, Van Ness at the bottom. Clay is right in the middle of this map. And this is James Stetson's location on the northwest corner of Clay and Van Ness. Let's look at some of his neighbors. Across the street on the southwest corner was the very large house of Klaus Spreckels. And you've heard the name Spreckels all through San Francisco today. That family is known for its wealth, its philanthropy, and Klaus Spreckels was the patriarch of this family and had a very big, impressive house. So that's his neighbor across the street, across Clay. Over on the other side of Spreckels was the New Statler House. Again, another impressive Victorian house with lots of chimneys and doodads and gewgaws and towers, very fashionable for the time. And over on the other side of Stetson, on the corner of Washington, was the Ashe Mansion. And this is a very big house, too. Porter Ashe married a daughter of Charles Crocker, who was another very, very wealthy man, maybe one of the top 4 wealthy men in the West. And so to give his daughter a wedding present, he built her and her new husband this incredible house next door to Stetson on Washington Street in Van Ness.
Yeah, pictures. I've seen pictures of Teddy Roosevelt stopping at the Ashe Mansion on his tour of San Francisco in 1903.
Right, VIPs, right?
Yeah.
And right across the street from the Ashe Mansion is Stetson, one of his business partners, Holbrook. So his other business partner, Merrill of Holbrook, Merrill, and Stetson lived across Van Ness from these two. So the families intermarried. They were very well known. And he had a very handsome house that lasted quite a long time after the earthquake. And way over here, not very far, a couple blocks, is where the Haas-Lilienthal House was and is today. And we'll kind of follow all these folks as they go through the earthquake and as James Stetson experiences it.
It's just a plain little place, the Haas-Lilienthal House, compared to the rest of these places, right?
It's impressive, but it's kind of upper middle class, right? It's not the elite maybe, but it's pretty impressive. So here's James Stetson's house. Let's start with his account of the earthquake. And he writes this, he says in the beginning of his account, as the earthquake and the Great Fire in San Francisco in the year 1906 were events of such unusual interest, and realizing how faulty is man's memory after time passes, I have here jotted down a few incidents which I personally observed and shall lay them away, so that if in the future I should desire, I can refer to these notes made while the events were new and fresh in my mind with some assurance of their accuracy. So he wrote most of this memory in April, right after the earthquake, and he added a couple of extra updates in June, and then later he published it privately for his friends. So real quick, let's just talk about the earthquake itself and what happens. So on the morning of April 18th at 5:13 in my residence, 1801 Van Ness Avenue, I was awakened by a very severe shock of earthquake. The shaking was so violent that it nearly threw me out of bed. It threw down a large bookcase in my chamber, broke the glass front, and smashed 2 chairs. Another bookcase fell across the floor. The chandelier was so violently shaken that I thought it would be broken into pieces. The bric-a-brac was thrown from the mantel and tables and strewed the floor with broken china and glass. As soon as it was over, I got up and went to the window and saw the air in the street filled with a white dust, which was caused by the falling of masonry from St. Luke's Church on the diagonal corner from my room. So he's in one of these corner rooms.
Yeah. I want to say something about so in 1906, there was no such thing as daylight savings time. You know, we all annually go out to Lotta's fountain and commemorate the earthquake at 5:13. It's pitch black out there. But in 1906, 5:13 in the morning was daylight. And so he could see across the street and get a good view of the church.
And this is what St. Luke's Church looked like on the, let's see, that would be the southeast corner of Clay and Van Ness at the time. And you see it's a big masonry church. And what he describes is a collapse of the facade and good chunks of the church. Masonry does not do well in earthquakes. He says, I waited for the dust to settle, and I saw the damage which had been done. The roof and the points of the gables and ornamental stonework of the church had fallen, covering the sidewalk and lying piled up against the sides of the building to the depth of 8 or 10 feet. And here you see a postcard of two women standing next to that debris that just came down on the front of St. Luke's Church. And again, I guess we all have to consider how lucky everybody was that this happened so early in the morning and not later in the day.
Yeah,
So
nobody out on the street to get crushed.
Exactly. This is what St. Luke's looks like today, and it's very similar design from the old church, but it's a totally different building. So he says at that time, Rachel and Nora, who I think were servants both, were knocking at my door and inquiring if I were alive. I opened the door and they came in, Rachel badly frightened and Nora sprinkling holy water over the room. He checks on his daughter who lives around the corner. He finds her very frightened. Everybody's in the street. The chimneys had fallen down. She had actually been trapped in her room by the earthquake shifting the door frame, and they had to break down the door to get her out. She seems fine, though. She seems like she survived it okay. So at that point, Stetson, ever the businessman, goes and checks on one of his major businesses, right, David?
Yeah, he walks out to California Street, right? To the California Street Cable Railroad powerhouse, which is this big building on Hyde Street, right at California. And what does he find there, Woody?
Well, it's also a big brick building, as we just saw, that doesn't do well. He says he finds that 70 feet of the smokestack, the chimney, had fallen diagonally across the roof, and about 6 feet of it into the stable, where were 2 horses. Fortunately, it did not touch them, but before they were released, they squealed and cried most piteously. One of them was so badly frightened that he was afterward useless, and we turned him out to pasture, and he grew lean and absolutely worthless. So the horses were very frightened, but they did not get smashed by the chimney.
It's kind of what I expect for my future too, really.
When we put you to pasture. Okay. The watchman also was not injured, although he was surrounded by falling bricks and mortar. He said the water supply was stopped, and they later learned it was because the water mains had broken. And that is an important point that we'll see. Now, this is the site then, or roughly then. And then this is, you can go there today. It's where Trader Joe's is on Hyde Street, looking towards California. Little less grand, but a cool building, I think. So, okay, at that point,
some pictures of the construction of that building
of that supermarket.
Yeah.
So at that point, he decides he's going to go downtown and check on his other business. He says, I started on foot downtown. This was about 7 a.m. No cars were running, and he means like streetcars or cable cars.
Cable cars. I don't think there were many electric streetcars at that time.
There were a few, but not many. You're right. They were mostly like cable drawn. The sidewalks in many places were heaved up, chimneys thrown down, and walls cracked by the earthquake. I went on California Street over Nob Hill. So this is actually a picture on Van Ness, just north of Broadway. And that church in the distance there, that's St. Bridget Church. I'm just showing you this to give an idea of how the streets would be broken up, how the sidewalks were broken up. Something that he notices as he walks up California Street, up Nob Hill. And David, as he goes up Nob Hill, can we describe or maybe even look at a picture of what he would have seen at the top of Nob Hill in 1906?
Well, he lives on Van Ness with all his fancy neighbors, but up on top of Nob Hill, the really fancy people live. and what I think this audience probably knows the phrase the Big Four, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific, Southern Pacific people, the railroad barons who built enormous mansions on the top of Nob Hill between like Jones and Mason.
Mm-hmm. And that's Charles Crocker's house on the left, and just that's the biggest, really. And you can see the size of the people on the cable car, how large that mansion is. And then the David Colton, later Huntington mansion here. And so Charles Crocker mansion is where Grace Cathedral is today. And the David Colton house is where the Huntington Park is. And then if he walks a little farther, what does he see around the corner of Powell and
So this is
Mason, David?
kind of
Yeah.
looking the same directions,
From
but
Pine.
from Pine, yeah.
Yeah.
So on the left is Mark Hopkins' house, and then the other one is Leland Stanford Mansion, which kind of looks like about 10 houses by
10
itself,
houses
right?
in one.
Yeah, 10 houses in one.
And then this is the other big residence up there, James Flood Mansion, which looks much like this today. It's a real survivor. It's now the Pacific Union Club. And we saw, some of you before the show started saw David leaning on that fence as a young man. We showed a picture. Uh, he doesn't mention these houses, maybe because he just takes them for granted. He really gets to the crest of the hill and he looks down California Street. So this is a view looking up to where he would have been. We're in the Merchants Exchange building looking up to the Fairmont Hotel. You can see it up there at the crest of California Street. And he does mention that when he gets up there, he notices the Fairmont. He notices Grace Church, which is kind of on the left there underneath the top arrow. At the time, it was on California Street. And then he sees what we call Old St. Mary's Church, which is the second arrow I put up. And he says there's no outward sign of them being injured. And they look fine, actually, like they survived the earthquake okay. So this picture is 1905. We're looking west, and this is essentially what he would have seen after the earthquake, this landscape of buildings. So just kind of put that in your brain, because later we're going to see a picture of this same scene after the earthquake and after the fire. So he says, I got in sight of the business part of the city. I saw as many as 10 or 12 fires in the lower part of the city. The wind was light, and the smoke ascended in great columns, and the sun looked through it like a large copper disc. So let's talk a little bit about the fires that started. So this is a map of San Francisco, and right after the earthquake, there were a lot of fires. More than 50 started because of overturned chimneys or stoves or chemicals or boilers. And most of them were put out pretty quick, especially the ones in the outlying areas where neighbors got there quick or firefighters got there quick. And so they were exhausted pretty fast. But much bigger fires started south of Market and north of Market at the Embarcadero, and they were quickly problematic. So here is some of the areas where the fires downtown were started. And just to give you a idea of where Stetson's house was, it's the green arrow here. And later they decided, a lot of these fires got started because of large paint factories or factories that had large fires or boilers, or big flammable warehouses. And so once they got started, they were very difficult to put out. He says, when I arrived at California and Montgomery Streets, the lower part of both sides of California Street seemed to be all on fire. I did not realize that the whole city would be burned. I had a vague sense that it would stop or be stopped, as fires had been hundreds of times before in this city.
I like this
So
picture. I like this picture because it really shows the beginnings of the fire, right? The fire department is active and they're working and they actually seem to have some water pumping from their engine there. So,
And we're about Liedersdorf looking east, and you can see the fire. That's pretty much what he was walking into when he went to go check on his office. And first he goes to the store, Holbrook, Maryland, Stetson, and this is what the building looked like. And he sees that it's all on fire. So he's like, yeesh. So then he decides, I got to get out. I'm going to go to my personal office, which is in a building called the Commercial Building. And when he gets there, he finds it's not on fire yet. He goes to the entrance at 123 California Street, and he meets the janitor coming out. And the janitor says, you cannot go upstairs as the building is on fire on the 5th floor. However, I started slowly up. The sparks were coming down into the open area in a shower, but there was no smoke in the building, so I was sure that it was not on fire on the inside. I got up to yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say that Stetson is funny. I mean, he's a guy that is a successful businessman, and he pretty much does what he wants, and that's what we'll find throughout his story. He'll be, people will tell him something, and he'll just ignore their advice and do what he was going to do.
Yeah, well, this is a good example. The janitor says the fire's on the 5th floor. He goes to his room on the 5th floor and he finds the door would not come open. He said, I tried the door in the adjoining office and found it open. So he gets in and then he gets into his room and he raises the shades. The fire was blazing at Battery Street in California, fully 70 feet high and not more than 300 feet distant from me. So this is a view down Battery from Market towards where California is, just to give you a sense of what he's walked himself into. And he's actually, he succeeds in opening a safe, getting a lot of mementos, deeds, cash, and there's a little aftershock from the earthquake while he's doing this. But he takes what he can and he goes down to the street. He says, the sparks were plentiful in the area when I went up, but they were more so as I came back down. A perfect firestorm after the manner of a snowstorm. When I got back on California Street, the air was a mass of sparks and smoke being blown down the street toward the ferry. As I had to go against it to get to Front Street, I was afraid that my papers would take fire in my arms, so I buttoned up my coat to protect my papers, pulled my hat over my eyes, and dived through up California Street and out front towards Pine from where I started. There I found it clear of smoke and fire. So this is a view of Embarcadero at Sacramento. He basically gets back to the Market Street and he's like, oh, okay, there's no fire here. There's no smoke. But like these guys, he's basically sitting there watching it, trying to figure out, what do I do now?
Well, that's that and the picture before with the crowds of people just watching the fire. These are some of the most amazing pictures that I've seen, where it just like it really brings home the idea that they didn't know what was going to happen and it didn't happen instantly. And they were like, oh, there's a fire. Let's go out and check it out.
Yeah.
Take a look. I don't think all those guys were thinking, I got to get up in my office and get my papers. They're just there as gawkers, really.
They might not have been that worried. Yeah. And then at this point, things get worse, actually. So we have these fires downtown, and about 9 a.m., a new fire starts, a big one in Hayes Valley. And we call this the ham and eggs fire. David, can you explain why we call it the ham and eggs fire?
Well, it's a typical breakfast dish, Woody. Ham and eggs.
How does the fire get started?
9 a.m. Somebody in Hayes Valley decides, well, I got to make breakfast as usual. And I think what happened was that their chimney was blocked, and it caused the house to catch. I think it probably a broken chimney. Sparks went up, caught the house on fire, and that doomed Hayes Valley and possibly the Mission District.
Yeah, it became really the biggest fire in a lot of ways in the end. So this starts after the earthquake, and again, it's a person who accidentally starts it. So he doesn't know this is happening, but it's about this time. Stetson says, where am I going to take my valuables now? My building is going to burn up soon. So he goes down to the middle of Market Street. He has a rest, and his friend, W.R. Whittier, comes along and helps him with his load of stuff.
Whittier of the Whittier Mansion on Jackson Street, I believe.
Yeah, we'll find he keeps running into other wealthy businessmen in his trip today. Whittier goes with them, and they take it to the door of the Union Trust Company. There's the ham and eggs fire, by the way. You see the smoke on the right, that's downtown, and then you see this new plume of smoke on the left, and that's the ham and eggs fire getting started. Quick aside about this picture is taken from Liberty Hill, and all these buildings, almost all of them between this view and the smoke are going to be burned. Spoiler alert. So a lot of loss. So they go to the Union Trust Company building, the bank there, and they try to get in, and they won't let them in. But then because they're rich guys, they get a way in. The bank manager or whoever is there takes it and puts his belongings in a vault for them and for him. And he thinks, okay, now my stuff is safe. We can kind of check out what's going on. But the Union Trust building does eventually get burned. And that's to your point, David, that people think, okay, I'm way outside the fire now. It'll be safe. And then that ends up burning too. Happens a lot over these 3 days.
an aside about the Union Trust building, it did, as you can see on the right, survive. The frame survived. It was rebuilt, and it was right next to the Hobart building, which was built later, and it survived into the 1960s, and
Yep.
then was demolished for 44 Montgomery, I think, next door. And
Yeah.
so that's why we have on the Hobart building that big flat side.
Yeah, that you can see where it says Hobart Building.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point, especially for Heritage's preservation mission. The buildings that did survive or were rebuilt, some of them were lost not because of a disaster, but because people didn't value them and wanted to build something else. Okay, he goes to 3rd Street in Mission, looks down 3rd Street and sees there's a giant fire going there south of Market. He keeps walking, and this is another coincidence, I guess. He sees his son passing in an automobile. And there weren't many automobiles at the time, but it was kind of a funny random coincidence. He gets in the car with his son, and his son says he's going to the mechanics pavilion where he said he could do some work for the temporary hospital established there. So where's the mechanics pavilion, or where was it, David?
So the Mechanics Pavilion is right on exactly on the site of the Civic Auditorium. So that's Grove and Larkin, right? That's the view we're looking at here from actually City Hall Avenue
Mm-hmm.
toward the intersection of Grove and Larkin.
So right in today's Civic Center where the Bill Graham
Yeah,
Auditorium is. Yeah.
yeah.
So he says when we reached the pavilion, they said there were 200 wounded inside. And these were people wounded from the earthquake, from falling buildings and rubble. At this hour, there was no building on fire on the south line of Market Street west of Fremont. We went around to the drugstores and hardware stores to get hot water bags and oil and alcohol stoves and surgeon's appliances. We took with us Miss Sarah Fry, a Salvation Army woman who was energetic and enthusiastic. And she's kind of a little mini hero in this. Here are people bringing the wounded, bringing injured people to the temporary hospital in the mechanics pavilion. They go with Miss Sarah Fry, the energetic and enthusiastic Salvation Army woman, and they go to a drugstore under the St. Nicholas Hotel, which is just across the street, essentially. She jumped out and, finding the door locked, seized a chair and, raising it above her head, smashed the glass doors in and helped herself to hot water bags, bandages, and everything which would be useful in an emergency hospital.
Go, Sarah.
I know. I want her on my side in a
I,
disaster.
I think she will probably bear some further research
I
for us to
agree.
see what happened to Sarah Fry later.
I agree. So he drives around with his son for a couple hours. Then he starts down Market Street about 10:30, and he sees that the fire is raging strong south of Market Street from about 5th to 10th Street. So here it is looking down from 5th. This fire keeps growing. He leaves Market and goes to Golden Gate Avenue. And at Hyde and Golden Gate Avenue, I saw a large 2-story house which had been wrecked by the earthquake. The doors, windows, and all the upright portion of the first story were crushed and stood on at an angle of 45 degrees. I inquired of a woman seated on a pile of rubbish who said, "No one was killed, but what am I to do?"
And I think this is the exact location. We've had, we were challenged to find the exact locations at the times that he
Mm-hmm.
was walking the streets, but I think this one is exactly that building
Yeah.
on Golden Gate.
He might even be in this picture for all we know. So he says the City Hall, he goes and looks at City Hall. It's badly wrecked. Great cracks were to be seen. About 2/3 of the Great Dome had fallen. So yeah, this is really bad. The whole City Hall complex really took a beating. Just look at the piles of rubble, higher than those women. And this is one of these funny little anecdotes that come when you hear about people's accounts of the earthquake. Because at that point, he goes, I'm kind of hungry. So he goes to his club, the Pacific Union Club, which at the time was at the corner of Post and Stockton Street, right off Union Square, and he gets himself a sandwich and a cup of coffee. He said it's the first food he had tasted that day, about 11 o'clock. So at 11 o'clock in the morning of the earthquake and the fire's raging, he goes to his club and gets a meal, David.
Business as usual in some parts.
Yeah, they're working at the club. But again, it's just the way they think, like, okay, well, we're outside the fire zone. This is fine. This is what the club would look like a couple days later, just to give you a little preview of what's going to happen. And the other, there's refugees in Union Square at the time, people with their bags, and also just tourists, people staying at the hotel who come out to the square to look at the fire in the distance. They, again, they don't know, or they're maybe not anticipating that this fire is going to go farther and farther, closer and closer.
They seem pretty relaxed. I mean, half of them are the ones in the foreground are just laying there in the
Yeah,
park on the grass.
yeah. So that building in the center, actually, both those buildings with the framework are not damaged buildings. They were under construction at the time of the earthquake. So that's what we're seeing there.
The bird cage.
Yeah. At that point, he comes out of the club. He sees the fire is really raging south of Market, and here's a shot looking in that direction. And he gets called. He runs into a police officer who notifies him. Again, you can just find Mr. Stetson, I guess, to meet the mayor at the Hall of Justice, who called a meeting of leading citizens for 2:00. And that's the building he's going to go to, the Hall of Justice, which was where, David, at the time?
Right on Portsmouth Square on Kearny Street. A lot of, it was there for years. Rebuilt version.
Yeah, it's where the Hyatt is, right?
Yeah.
Where the Hyatt is today,
The
facing
hotel
Portsmouth
there.
Square. And this is it after the earthquake. There's a lot of men from Chinatown walking to Portsmouth Square, and they have the meeting there. Again, that's where the mayor says the city hall's ruined, so we're going to meet here in this safe building. But again, that building does not prove to be safe very long. He walks back out with Mr. J.E. Tucker to Market Street, and they sit on a box opposite Lotta's fountain, and they discuss the situation. He says at that point, we agreed that the city was doomed to destruction and that we were unable to do anything to save it. So we're seeing the fire now reaching the Call building, which is now called the Central Tower on 3rd Street at Market. It's that one with the very pointy tower in the middle of this shot. He says crowds of people were about, only looking on, some looking dazed and others wildly excited. So here's Mission Street between 1st and 2nd. And these people are actually moving now. You can see that all their belongings are piled up, and they're kind of waiting and watching, wondering how far they should be carrying their stuff.
Yeah.
Again, he runs into another rich friend of his. It's kind of like if Mark Benioff was walking around and he runs into, I don't know, somebody more reprehensible than him on the street. I don't know. And
I run into people run into me all the time on the street.
Yeah.
So I see people I know on the street.
Your wealthy peers? Okay.
Yes.
He walks down to Bush Street between Sansom and Montgomery, meets Mr. Murphy of the First National Bank, which is the building with the tower here, and Herman Ulrichs, and discussed with them as to whether the fire would come to their building. And it does. This is it after the fire. He says he went along Montgomery Street to California and found the fire approaching Montgomery Street. So this is a view from the Merchants Exchange building. We saw that picture looking up California. This is looking the other way at the fire about to engulf the Mutual Life building on Sansom Street. And here it is after the fire. At 3:00, it had got to the Palace Hotel on Mission Street side, and by 3:30, it was well on fire. Go ahead.
I think that the Palace Hotel had its own water supply, and they fought the fire for a while and thought that they could save it, but then they ran out.
Yeah, yeah. And people, I think the firemen used some of their water to fight it in other places too. So they didn't have it. This is the old Palace Hotel. Of course, it got rebuilt, but here it is on fire, and the earlier Grand Hotel on the other side of what is now New Montgomery Street. He says
useless horses too there.
Yeah, horses. He starts walking home up California Street, and he says at that time the streets were filled with people dragging trunks and valises along, trying to find a place of safety. So here we're looking down California. That's the old Grace Church steeple on the right. And you can see that people are starting to head west. They know what's happening now. As night came on, the fire made it as light as day, and I could read without any other light in any part of my house. At 8 in the evening, he decides to go down and see the situation. So where is this picture from, David, the first night?
This is looking north from Potrero Hill, about 22nd, 20th in Wisconsin or something like that, up
Uh-huh.
in Potrero Hill.
Yeah, so this shows how bright it must have been.
Yeah.
He goes back downtown about 8. He can't get away. He keeps going downtown to check on things. So he goes home, he goes downtown. He sees the fire continue. He sees that it gets to the Hall of Justice where he had been and that few people were on the street. So he goes back home, and about 11 o'clock the first day, he goes to bed and he sleeps till 2:30 a.m. and he gets up again to go downtown and see what the situation is.
He's 77 years old or something.
He's like 75
right?
or something.
75,
Yeah.
yeah.
He's walked up and down Nob Hill like 3 times already. So here's the fire downtown at California Market at night. And then here's the situation about about midnight that first night. So you have the fires downtown. Now they've covered a big chunk of south of Market. And the Ham and Eggs fire has taken out the Civic Center, taken out the Mechanics Pavilion. They had to move all those wounded people out, and now is encroaching on the Mission District. So again, remember this picture looking up California? Overnight, over that first night, this is what happens. There's the Fairmont again. There is Mark Hopkins' house that we passed going over the hill. And there's Old St. Mary's. So after the fire, this is what that landscape looks like. Over that first night, all of this is what burned. He goes back up and checks it out. He says the St. Francis Hotel's on fire. The Fairmont's on fire. He's surprised. He thinks the Fairmont, could maybe survive, but there's paint and other oils in there because they're under construction, and it catches on fire. He sees that St. Mary's Church is now on fire, and Chinatown was in a, quote, whirlpool of fire.
I could imagine that Chinatown would just go right up because it's all, low wooden buildings, all built very close together.
Yeah, very tight, very compact and dense. He says he returns. So then he goes home again. He says both streets were thronged with men, women, and children, some with bundles, packages, and baby carriages. But the usual method was to drag a trunk, which made a harsh scraping noise on the sidewalk, which is a nice sensory element to add to this whole scene. And here's a guy dragging his trunk. You can just imagine. He catches up with the guy and helps him drag his trunk. Again, this guy's in his 70s. And the guy thinks, oh, maybe you're trying to steal it. I mean, there was a little thought, but then he thanks him for helping to drag his burden. He says the throng of moving people, men and women with babies and bird cages and everything which they held most valuable on earth, began early Wednesday morning the next day and continued until the afternoon of Thursday. So this is people dragging trunks. He talks about people using chairs and baby carriages, wheelbarrows. So these are folks going west on Lombard Street in the marina, today's marina, just getting out of town. So
it wasn't really very built up at that time.
No, and that was helpful. But early in the morning of the next day, April 19th, he goes back to the California Street Powerhouse, has a talk with the superintendent who was there, who tells him, I took all the cars out, as many as I could, because the water was shut off. I couldn't start the power. He couldn't get steam up. He didn't have horses. So nothing could be done but to push the cars out and let them roll out into the street. Some 8 of them 8 blocks away. Some of them went 8 blocks away. 52 cars in number. All were burned. Not one was left. So this is a California Street cable car incinerated in the middle of California Street, about Polk, because there's our Spreckles mansion. Remember he's a neighbor of Stetson over on Clay Street in Van Ness. So you wake up the next morning, the day after the earthquake. This is what our fire map looks like now. The Ham and Eggs fire is in the Mission, and boy, that fire is getting a lot closer to Stetson in his green arrow. He can see the fires by 11:30 of that morning, coming down Jones Street at Clay and as far as Sutter and Leavenworth. The flames were continuous all on the top of Nob Hill. By 2:30, they were approaching Van Ness at Hyde and Washington, and he's looking out through his front room with field glasses, watching every house after house, just catching fire and going up. He says, I saw many pigeons flying wildly about, seeking some place of safety. As it approached Van Ness, it did not burn north of Washington Street, the wind being northwest. And Van Ness is a very wide street, so he's pretty sure the fire won't cross, although it is just across the street from him at this point.
Right.
Now, at this point, they say, okay, Van Ness is a wide street. Maybe we can stop the fire with a fire break. And they start dynamiting buildings on the east and the west side of Van Ness. And then for the ham and eggs fire, they start dynamiting buildings to the south of like 15th Street. So he explains how they do this. Sometimes it's dynamite. Sometimes they just set a house on fire to create a backfire. And I told you, David, how they're setting the fires in the house. It was kind of an unusual thing he described.
Yeah, they bring some flammable liquid in a dish up to the, up into the second stories or upper floors, and just pretty much close the curtains and light the curtains on fire, then break the windows to create a draft through the house, and the places just go up like chimneys.
Yeah. And he talks about the dynamiting is shaking his house and breaking windows. He says that after it was over, I found that it had demolished in my house 12 plates and 54 sheets of glass, each measuring about 30 by 50 inches. So his windows all blew out with the dynamiting. And then at 4:45 in the afternoon, I was ordered out of my house by the soldiers, not in a quiet manner, but with an order that there was no mistake in its terms and meaning. About like this: get out of this house. I replied, but this is my house and I have a right to stay if I choose. Get out damn quick and make no talk about it either. So a soldier with a bayonet on his gun marched me up Clay Street to Gough amid flames, smoke, and explosions. So he climbs up, he tries to sit down and rest. Again, he's 75 years old. And a soldier on the opposite side of the street leveled his gun and cried out, get out of that, old man, and go up on Gough Street. As he had a loaded gun and appeared very important, I quickly obeyed his polite order. As I reluctantly ascended Clay Street in charge of the soldier, I held back long enough to see the steeple of the Presbyterian Church, that's on Sacramento and Van Ness, fall. I stayed at Gough Street a while, looking down upon my house, expecting every minute to see the flames coming out of it.
The more times we read this account, the more I start to think that he was a guy that really got his way pretty often. And so this particular, these interactions with these young soldiers was particularly galling for him, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. And he had to have a gun and a bayonet to make him do something. Just to kind of give an example of what you're talking about, David, he's up at Lafayette Park essentially, and he notices the heat is so intense that the guards leave. And so seeing no one near, I slipped down quietly the north side of Washington Street to Franklin. As no one was around there, I continued to Washington and Van Ness, and putting up my coat collar and protecting the side of my face with my hat, I ran along Van Ness Avenue to my front door and quickly got into the house again at 5:40, being kept out 55 minutes. My clothes got very hot, but was not scorched. This I did at great risk of my life, for these soldiers were very arrogant and consequential at having a little brief authority, and I was afraid they would not hesitate to shoot on slight provocation. So he basically runs along a fiery Van Ness Avenue to get back to his house. So here, just a little animation to show you a little illustration. Here's Sacramento Street at Van Ness. This is an earlier photo, but that's the Presbyterian Church on the right that he sees the steeple fall.
Hot water?
And, what's that?
No, but that's okay.
Somebody's talking. That's Mr. Merrill's house, his partner across the street. That house gets dynamited. And the ruins of St. Luke's and the ruins of the Presbyterian Church are both dynamited as well. And that's St. Luke's there. And he says at this point, a new danger threatened. The range of blocks on the north side of Washington to the south side of Jackson, that's a block from his house, were on fire. And the flames coming toward Van Ness with the possibility of crossing. So a new fire starts a couple blocks over. And the Spreckle stable on Sacramento, this is his neighbor right across the street. Right. And also the houses back of the New Statler residence were now on fire. This I knew would set fire to the other houses on Clay and the dynamited house of Mr. Gunn, all fronting on Clay Street between Van Ness and Franklin. And this
It's
picture
getting
from
close.
Lafayette, yeah.
Getting close.
Yeah, you see this picture from Lafayette Square, you can kind of see the fire. It looks like it's crossed Van Ness now. So real quick, here's where we are. There's Stetson's house. We're back here. They dynamite Mr. Gunn's house, which is kind of strange, up at Clay and Franklin. And then New Statler, the Spreckles stables, and these cottages next door all catch fire. So that is where we are. The fire is right across the street from him now. And he's watching this. He's watching the fire across Clay. He's watching the fire approach from the east down, the hill towards Van Ness.
Right.
And he's basically trying to figure out which one is going to reach him first. My windows were so hot that I could not bear my hand on them. And so he was ready to put out fires. He had buckets of water. He's alone in his house. Most people have left. And at 10 o'clock, he was pretty certain that it wasn't going to cross Van Ness, and he hoped it wouldn't cross Clay. But about this time, as the heat had somewhat subsided, I ventured out and saw a small flame about as large as my two hands just starting on the tower of Mrs. Schwabacker's house, which is next to mine on Clay. Oh, no.
What time is it now? Or were you?
He said it's about 10 o'clock at night on the second day.
Wow.
Yeah. And so what does he do now, David, if there's a fire on the roof next door to him?
Well, desperate times, right? You got to put that out. So I think he got some passersby who were still out at 10 o'clock. I mean, you don't know what was happening with all the people everywhere. And I think he tried to offer them like a $10, $20 gold piece to go and put out that fire on the eve of the house, right?
Yeah, they climb up on the roof and put it out on the tower. It's like a pointy tower. Yeah. And he basically, so he gets the shingles later that are charred that they get put out, and he saves them and frames them in his house later because he thought it was such an important thing. It would have burned the rest of the Western Addition, he was sure.
I'm going to look for those at an estate sale someday.
I know. I want to find those charred shingles that he framed. So this is what it is. You see the fire is now right near the star, and we're going to go kind of fast. Another fire starts across the street and burns the Bothan house, a friend of his. And at this point, the Spreckles house catches on fire. No surprise, although it was a little. And, Stetson's so tired that he feels like because the Spreckles house, is not wood, he feels like, oh, well, even though it's on fire, I'm going to take a nap. I'm going to at least go to sleep because it probably won't cross. And you can see the Spreckles house totally gets gutted and burned. Oh, by the way, that's the tower in the background of the neighbor's house, that little pointy tower. That's where the shingles were. So the Spreckles house is burning. He's got right across the street from him. It's coming from Van Ness. The fire is getting bad. And then right when he thinks he's safe, some enthusiastic soldiers dynamite a building at Green and Van Ness, which, this is the real tragedy on the third day, starts another fire, a different fire at Green and Van Ness. And this fire starts burning, and the wind changes, and it essentially goes back over Russian Hill, burns all the way over Russian Hill, goes back towards North Beach. And the firefighters that are doing such great work on the other side of Russian Hill, on Lombard and what's today Columbus, suddenly find fire on both sides. And that's what takes out North Beach, most of Russian Hill. There was a little section which is still there, a lot of these houses up at Jones, Taylor, Broadway, which were saved. They fought really hard. The residents used vinegar and any liquid in their house to fight back the flames.
There's a block on Green that also survived, right? Right up there to the summit. I think there was one thing where, it's a third day, everyone's demoralized and exhausted, and they see this house on the slope on the left there, on the right there, and it's flying an American flag. And the volunteers are, get motivated, and they're like, we have to save the house of the flag. And and that's what saved the summit of Russian Hill. And I think that that house still stands and was known for decades as the House of the Flag, right?
Yeah. This is what happens. It goes over to Telegraph Hill, burns North Beach. And then he says, again, he's still anxious. Nobody knows how long if these fires will start again, what'll happen. But he says in the third day, after the third day, I found it then and ever since very difficult to locate myself when wandering in the ruins and in the rebuilt district, as all the old landmarks are gone. And the only guide often is a prominent ruin in the distance. So this is looking back down California Street again. That's burned out Grace Church, burned out St. Mary's on the left. And you can imagine it's just shocking to people. So like a lot of go ahead, David.
That's the same method I use to locate all these earthquake ruin shots. You look for a landmark, and as an aside, there, I think that is why we have the incised street names in our curbs today, because of this earthquake.
Because the fire burned all the street poles, and so they wanted to have some way to identify a street if they got burned. So like most people, he didn't have gas or water for a few days, so they cooked in the street. People would bring stoves out into the street. And this wasn't in the show last night. We just got it today from our friend Glenn Koch. Here is a street kitchen on Franklin Street, right next to Washington. And in the distance, that tower, David, looks a little familiar in that building.
That's your office up there in that tower. That's the Haas-Lilienthal House.
I've never seen a picture of the Haas-Lilienthal House right after the earthquake, and here today I got one. So we're going to take a closer look at that and kind of examine it, but that's quite a treasure. Thank you, Glenn, for giving us that picture. There it is right there. Okay, so he says, this ended the conflagration, but for 3 nights thereafter, fires were smoldering timbers and slow burning debris. They were sufficient to light up my room so that I could see to read. I was still in fear of a fire breaking out in the unburnt district west of Van Ness Avenue, and as there was no water in the pipes, we would be as helpless as ever. This gave much anxiety during the 2 weeks following the calamity, which I think this is from the Ferry building, looking up Market. You can see it's all still smoldering and smoking. And I think we all relate to this with the recent fires in California. You just never know. Like, is it over? Is it not over? Is there going to be another fire? And they were all experiencing that. This is just, right near the Haas-Lilienthal House. This is looking east on Jackson across Van Ness. You can see how everything burned up to Van Ness. It's amazing Stetson's house survived. He walks around for weeks with wire cutters in his pocket because he says so many wires were down that just across the street sometimes he had to cut them. This is the landscape he walks around. He gets food from the relief agency. He said bread we were able to buy after a few days. On May 3rd, we were able to buy the staple articles of food. Up to that time, they got everything they needed from the relief committee, an amazing effort we'll do in another show. Let's just talk about it. So here's a view from Leavenworth and Clay, and let's just zoom in over here. We're looking west, and here's Stetson's house. Here's the Spreckles, his neighbor. They've already got scaffolding up. And at this point, they survived great, but Van Ness Avenue, the character of it changes, right, David? This is a different avenue now after the earthquake and fire.
Right. As we mentioned, it was, a place of the rich merchants, and all the merchants had their stores and offices burned out in the business district. So they had to move to what was available, which was Van Ness Avenue. And this is what turned Van Ness Avenue into a commercial strip. Temporary and then, department stores and other businesses.
And some of the department stores relocated into empty mansions that were still there. It's kind of interesting. And then so later it becomes the automobile rises as a personal thing, and it becomes the city's auto row. And a lot of the houses that are surviving get torn down for auto dealerships and garages. Let's kind of go through the neighbors again real quick. So this is his neighbor right next door on Washington and Van Ness. This is the Ash House. And after the earthquake, the family doesn't move back in, even though the building survived. and a mysterious fire burns it in 1913. It's basically an abandoned house at that point, and it gets torn down. And an auto dealership and later a garage go into that space. The Spreckles mansion across the street, it survived. You saw the scaffolding, it gets restored, but the family really never moves back again. And then in 1927, they sell it, demolish it. And what's there today? Apartment buildings. These are actually called the Spreckles apartments that were built on the site of the Spreckles mansion on the southwest corner of Clay and Van Ness.
And I want to just say briefly that, this sort of thing, this huge house, the families had changed. They had spread out. They had moved on the peninsula or whatever. And
Yeah.
so there were mansions like this all over the area that were not being used anymore.
Right. They'd stopped fulfilling their purpose. You're trying to show off and be ostentatious. They did it in other places after the earthquake because Van Ness was not the place to do it. So here's Stetson's house. As I said, he dies in the house in 1909. So he lives there till his death. And then the heirs sell it. And now it's this bank building, which, by the way, I think is for sale, David, if you want to buy that bank building.
Can I rebuild the Stetson house there?
Sure, you can rebuild the Stetson house if you like. And this is kind of the tragedy, but gets closer to what our mission is at San Francisco Heritage. His business partner, Charles Holbrook, who lived a block away over on Van Ness in Washington, his house survives a long time, all the way through World War II. Here it is in 46. And at that point, the house was sold along with all those other houses you see on that block for a used auto lot, like a parking lot to sell used cars, not even a building, which was there for quite a long time until, well, in between. This was built and is there today. A lot of housing, at least. So that was sort of the end of those mansions and that row of Van Ness Avenue. It was the earthquake, the dynamiting and the fires got rid of some of it, but it was really the change of fashion that doomed a lot of those mansions over time. And it really speaks to how important and special and significant it is that we have the Haas-Lilienthal House. And I encourage you to come and take a tour. We have tours on Wednesdays and Saturdays right now. One of our docents can show you around. You can see what a house looked like. It's an amazing place because it's a house that was never bought or sold. It was in the family from when it was built in 1886 to when they gave it to San Francisco Heritage in 1973. So it's
that's just an amazing fact. When you said that last night, I was like, wow.
Yeah, you don't find many places like that. And then there's a cool thing you can see that's related to the earthquake and what we talked about. On the wall of the the main staircase is a crack from the earthquake that the Haas family, they kept it. They kind of kept it as a memento of the big tragedy, and to remember it, they never repaired the wall. So you can see the crack when you come visit sometime. And that's it. That's the end of our show. We went a little long, I think, but I think, David, we're okay staying and answering questions as long as people